Welcome back. In our discussion over the last few lectures, we have more or less looked into how to work with the different types of materials data, whether that is numeric data, whether that is some categorical data where you are doing one-hot encoding. And then we have seen how we can add in different types of features, whether those are composition weighted features or they are physics based features that we can capture from the different physical laws and models. We have also seen how we can work with images and microstructures. So after we looked into all of these things, we were able to get an idea of how to develop a computational pipeline for doing materials informatics. And furthermore, we also looked into how we can interrogate the machine learning models that we are designing in order to extract some physical insights. Having looked at that, we also looked at some of the new approaches that people are trying out, such as physics-informed neural networks. What now remains for us is to explore how we can actually augment this process of materials informatics by using some other types of techniques. And for that, we are going to look at basically three different types of techniques. So the first one that we are going to talk about is how you can do experiments in a little bit more systematic and intelligent manner. Namely, how can you do combinatorial materials processing? So combinatorial materials processing is a very interesting field which has been coming up quite recently, and that allows you to develop a broad range of alloys or different types of materials in a very short period of time. This approach on combinatorial materials processing will then be supplemented by high throughput characterization so that we can extract a lot of information about this large database of alloys that we are making experimentally. So we will be looking into high throughput characterization in the next lecture. And our final way of augmenting our data sets would be to create synthetic microstructures. So with that in mind, let us go forward and look into combinatorial materials processing. Now, there is actually a very pressing need for combinatorial materials processing because despite all of the advances in the theory of materials and in the computational methods, the ultimate test of any theory or any model remains the experimental evidence. Now, performing experiments is pretty expensive, it is laborious, and it takes time. And therefore, usually what you will notice that the experimental data rather than any computational data or theoretical models are relatively rare. So if there is a way in which we can speed up our experiments, then that would be really useful in terms of generating data very fast. So if you want to develop machine learning models in cases where your data set is really sparse or maybe even non-existent, then taking this combinatorial type of approach supplemented by high throughput characterization would allow you to create a database in a relatively small period of time by using only experimental data. And as we have emphasized continuously, that materials informatics is really a sparse data problem, and in some of these cases the sparse data can be excessively sparse. So this is where our combinatorial type of techniques comes in. But as we do this, we have to keep a few things in mind. So for example, if we are trying to speed up the collection of experimental data, are there any caveats or are there any drawbacks to this process? What are the things that we need to be careful about? These are the things that we need to focus today. What we will see though is combinatorial material science is now becoming a very important tool by which you can accelerate the discovery of novel materials, and this becomes especially potent when you combine this type of experiments with materials informatics and machine learning. So just to give you an idea about how important this field is now becoming, I just wanted to put up a couple of examples. So the first one is a book called Combinatorial Material Science. This is a book which is edited by Balaji Narasimhan, Surya Malapragada and Mark Porter. And then you will also see that a periodical no less than MRS Bulletin dedicated an entire issue to this field of combinatorial material science. So this is something which is coming up nowadays, and this is something which holds the key to leveraging materials informatics properly going forward into the future. So if I am going to design a combinatorial experiment, what does that mean? What are the different schemes by which I can design? Let us look into that. So the first scheme that we want to talk about is what we call mixture design. So for instance, if I am trying to explore a ternary alloy system which has got three different elements, let us say it has got element A, element B and element C. How do we come up with this mixture design of experiment? So the first step is you will have to create a grid, and this grid is really going to come from the intuition of the experimentalist. As we have been stressing quite a bit, in order to do materials informatics, you need to understand materials first. So if you have some sort of an intuition about your experiment, if you have some guesses as to where the compositions of interest would be, you have to select these compositions. So for instance, if you look at the second figure over here, we have got different types of different colors of dots. We have got blue dots, we have got yellow dots and so on. So the blue dots are the ones where we do the experiments initially. So in other words, the compositions marked with blue dots are the ones that you as the experimentalist would be using your own intuition in order to figure out. Once you have figured out these blue dots, you perform the experiments, you look at the results of those experiments, and then after that you take the call where further experiments can be done. So you have an initial set of experiments, and then what you are basically doing is when you are looking at any target property, you are experimentally fine-tuning it by selecting compositions which lies between the original compositions. So this is how you will come up with a mixture design. Now this type of approach is quite convenient if you are working with a binary or even a ternary system, but then if you are working with multi-component system, whether that is something like steels or superalloys or high entropy alloys, there the visualization challenge is actually quite significant. So this is one of the challenges that you will face when you are looking at this mixture design type of approach. Another type of approach to designing combinatorial experiments is this compound design approach, and this type of approach is taken when you are looking at very complex problems. And just to give you an idea about what I mean by a complex problem, this could be something at an industrial scale. So what that basically means is not only do you have to look at the underlying science and technology of the material processing, but you also need to understand the economics, maybe even the marketing aspects of this type of product. So essentially what we are doing, we start with different aspects of the database. So for example, if we are trying to make a polymer blend, we need to know what is the cost of the raw material. After that, not only are we concerned about the cost of the raw material, we are also concerned about what are the material properties. Once you have this initial database with the cost of the raw material and the properties of the raw material, after that you come into the actual process where you are looking at the blending data. So how does this blend form? What would govern the uniformity of the blend? So the process condition is going to be definitely one important factor. There might be different types of parameters that you can control to optimize the process. Then the material themselves in terms of all of the raw materials, that comes into the picture. And then if you already have a data set about the properties of the mixture, meaning whether the properties are simply a weighted average or whether the properties are something which is not describable by a weighted average, those values would be really useful for us. So in that sense, this mixture property can become one of the target properties. Now, once you have this mixture property, you can compute a few other things. So for instance, you can also compute the cost of the material production. So once you do something like that, and then you try out predictions with different types of raw materials, different concentrations of raw materials, different process parameters, you will end up with the property of the mixture as the output or the first output, and then you have a second output in terms of the cost of your product. And then you can actually see what type of trade-off is there in order to improve the property vis-a-vis the cost of the product. So when you are approaching a problem like this, you will want to express your data in the form of a matrix. This is something that we have already discussed. And then one can use this CBFE type of approach to compute the properties of the blend if you do not already have those values with you. So this is a second way in which one can design experiments in a combinatorial fashion. After that, there is another approach, and this is a fairly standard approach for those of you who are coming from an engineering background. This is what we call the statistical design of experiments. So the basic idea underlying the statistical design of experiments is fairly simple. You want to design experiments for finding what the main effects are, and then you want to do a second layer of experimentation which will reveal the second order effects. And once you have the principal effects and the second order effects, you should be able to create a curve, or you should be able to create a surface that describes how the response to the experiment is going to come about. Now, how do you go about with the standard design of experiments? One could take this factorial design type of approach. So when you are looking at this from a factorial design of experiments perspective, you want to consider multiple factors, and each of these factors would be allowed to take some sort of a discrete value. So for example, if you are looking at a material processing problem, then you might be having 3 or 4 different process parameters. It could be things like the temperature, things like the applied strain, things like the applied stress. It could even be something like maybe you are moving this material from one place to another, so that creates a thermal gradient. Basically, you can have a variety of factors that affect the processing. So when you are doing a factorial design of experiments, you have to take into consideration all of these key factors and what levels these factors can take. So for example, you could consider a situation that the process occurs over a certain temperature range, and then you can divide that into 3 different levels: a relatively low temperature, a medium temperature, a high temperature. So you have to ensure that the factors that you are looking at are allowed to take discrete levels, and then you have to look into the experiments which captures all possible combination of these values. So in that sense, if you have got n different factors that has to be considered, and there are m different levels that can be permissible, then the total number of experiments that you will have to do would be m times n. So just to give you an idea, I'll put up a paper, or rather the reference to the paper from the Journal of Catalysis, where they have employed this type of statistical design of. So they're looking at different types of ratios and as their factors. So for example, this one is looking at the ratio of titania to silica, and so on and so forth. And then you have got a particular target value. Now, by varying these factors, they are able to do the experiments in this regions which are represented by the dots. And after you get the response value of the experiment performed at these dots, you can extrapolate and you can find a surface that describes the results of experiments. So the idea over here is, once you have got a surface like this, you can actually look at different combination of factors, find the corresponding point, and then look at what type of response you might be having. So this is the idea behind the statistical design of experiment. Now it turns out that there are a bunch of free softwares and design tools that one can use. Just putting up one of them like Statis, or you could use something else like jmp.com. I would encourage you to visit those websites in case you are interested in this type of design of experiment work. and then different softwares will have different features. You might want to go through them and see which one best fits your need. Now let us take a look at few examples just so that we understand how one can use combinatorial design of experiments or combinatorial materials processing in order to generate a variety of materials data. So the first example that we are going to look at is this paper where the researchers were looking to design magnets, and essentially what they have done is they have performed a bulk combinatorial synthesis in terms of making the magnets themselves, and in order to synthesize the magnets they have used the additive manufacturing process, which is known as lens or laser engineered net shaping type of approach. And here there's a number of things that the researchers have tried to explore. The first one is to create well-defined composition gradient by controlling the feed of the different types of powders that they are using. So when you are using an additive manufacturing process like this, you essentially have a laser beam, and then you will be feeding the powders through the sides, and then the powders come over here. As the laser interacts with the powder, it melts it and you have a molten pool. And if you are translating this entire system to one direction, you are essentially growing your product from left to right over here. Now, when they were trying to come up with this combinatorial synthesis of magnets, the second key idea they had was they wanted to look at iron cobalt alloys because it's known that iron cobalt alloys are good permanent magnets, but then they wanted to see how the cobalt content affects the magnetism. So in order to do that, they created a library of different alloys, an experimental library of different alloys, by preparing multiple samples which were shaped like fingers or rods. And essentially these samples are standing on a substrate. So what they have done is they have done the additive manufacturing, layer by layer manufacturing, and by depositing the powder on the substrate. And they start with a point, and then as they deposit more and more powders, this small speck with which they start with, the speck like this will eventually grow into rods like this. So in order to do this, you have to program the feed rates for the different powders, because there has to be certain pattern with which you are feeding the powders. As you are trying to make different compositions, the feed rate of the different powders would therefore have to be tuned accordingly. So in experiments like this, what happens is people use a little bit of robotics with a robot arm being used to move this laser and then the powder feed in a very programmed manner in order to generate different types of chemistries at different locations. So if you look at the iron cobalt phase diagram, you would see that you have very good solubility in certain range, but then as you come down with the temperature, you are going to have some amount of spinodal decomposition taking place. So when you try and design experiments like this, I cannot emphasize this strongly enough. Know your material system a little bit and then look into the phase diagram, see what compositions will really make sense, and then target those compositions accordingly in a combinatorial type of manner. So if you now start making compositions across the phase diagram, the question one needs to ask is what really changes? As you can see from the phase diagram, you expect there can be some amount of spinodal decomposition occurring. So it might happen that with certain levels of cobalt, you will have one type of crystal structure. As you change the cobalt content, the crystal structure might change. So one tries to look at these things by using X-ray diffraction in order to look at the crystal structure. So here, if you look at it, it does not look like your typical X-ray diffraction pattern, but then your x-axis is still your Bragg angle, so you still have the value of 2 theta. On y-axis, since we are trying to capture a lot of information, on the y-axis they have simply plotted the composition of the cobalt. And then the color of these streaks, which basically represent the peaks at those different compositions, gives you what the peak intensity is. So in that sense, think of a 3D type of diagram with the peak intensity coming out of the plane of the paper or plane of this slide along the z-axis. So as you can see, beyond certain critical compositions, new peaks starts to appear, and then some of the peaks that were appearing at the lower cobalt concentration, they start to go away. So in that sense, what you are doing is you are able to capture the phase transition as a function of composition at a given temperature. Now, one of the challenges of using this type of combinatorial experiments is that many of them happen to be inherently non-equilibrium in nature, meaning that the processing techniques that you are using is not close to thermodynamic equilibrium. So that might induce the possibility that you will be forming some sort of a metastable phase, or even if it is not a metastable phase with a completely new crystal structure, maybe this is a phase which can be seen in the equilibrium phase diagram, but then there could be some distortion in the lattice and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, the property of the metastable phase that is forming, or at least the high energy phases that are forming, need not be exactly the same as the equilibrium phases. And therefore, it is important when you do experiments like this to at least do some sort of benchmarking against the alloys that have been produced by conventional routes. Now, it is understood that you might be able to explore a lot more number of alloys by using this type of combinatorial type of experiments, but then there would hopefully still be some experimental work done on few discrete compositions by using some sort of conventional route. So here what the researchers have done, they have exactly tried to replicate the curve. So here what you will see is the Curie temperature has been plotted in the figure on the left as a function of the cobalt concentration, and then this red line is the results coming from this work, and then the black line is when somebody had actually done the experiments in a relatively conventional manner, and you can see that the values match in many cases, and in other cases, even if there is some discrepancy in the values, you will see that the trends are matching. So this is actually a very good way of exploring lots of alloys in one time. Similarly, in the plot on the right, what they have done is they have tried to measure the saturation magnetization as a function of the cobalt concentration. And then again, the red line represents the results from the work that we have been talking about. And then you have got a couple of other sets of results which have been established using conventional methods. Now, what I want you to focus on is, even if you are using conventional techniques and you are closer to the equilibrium, it is not necessarily true that the results are always going to match. When experiments are being done in two different groups, even if they are the same experiment, sometimes you can still have variation in the results. Maybe this is in this case we are talking about a magnet, but maybe there is a situation where you are looking at, let's say, oxidation process, something which is very much influenced by the surface condition. So even how well polished the surface is might be different from case to case, and definitely it would be different when you are looking at two completely different groups, and then that results in slight variations of the result. So if you have a situation where your results from the combinatorial type of experiments are reasonably well aligned with the results from the conventional experiments, you know that you have struck gold, and you can actually start relying on the data that is being generated by this combinatorial experiments. In addition to looking at the saturation magnetization as well as the Curie temperature, they have also looked at the lattice parameter, and again you see that there is a fairly good match, whether it is the lattice parameter of the BCC phase or the lattice parameter of the FCC phase, and both of it they have looked as a function of the cobalt concentration. So they have also looked at the magnetocrystalline constant, and what I really want to emphasize over here is that the red curve is the work that has been done using the combinatorial technique, and the blue curve is the one which was done previously, and you can see that there is a reasonably good agreement as far as the general trends are concerned. But what I want to emphasize here is, if you look at the older work, there were certain composition regions where the studies had not been performed. So if you can see that in a certain range, the combinatorial experiments have a reasonably good experiments with the traditional conventional experiments, then you can actually go ahead and expand upon the composition space by doing additional combinatorial experiments, and you can sort of extrapolate what this type of values would be in a space that has not yet been explored by traditional methods. Now, as we go forward, the pathway ahead seems that we need more and more accurate theoretical and computational models which will allow us to understand non-equilibrium processing phenomena a little bit better, because that might be something which can still restrict this development of alloys by doing combinatorial experiments. But nonetheless, if the experiments are done carefully, then there is a chance that the data that you are generating is fairly good quality data that can be used in machine learning models. Continuing with our examples, here's another example of combinatorial synthesis, and this time people have been using thin films. Now, what you will see that using approaches like thin films, where you can control the process parameters to get a gradient of composition, or using different types of additive manufacturing, where you can program the powder feed rates in order to ensure you get composition gradients or maybe multiple alloys with slightly different compositions. You will see that these two type of processing techniques are extremely common. So here, what the researchers were trying to do is they were looking at a composition space of high entropy alloys, and they were trying to see if they can find a single phase body centered cubic solid solution. So essentially what they did, they started with this combinatorial thin film experiment where they generated a library of compositions by gradually changing the biases for the target so that they can generate different alloy chemistries in different parts of the thin films. Now, in this work, the researchers were also trying to supplement their experimental data by ab initio. Of course, this is not strictly a part of your combinatorial experiments, but nonetheless, this is something that they did. So, they used this type of technique in order to synthesize a film, or in another case, even a bulk pellet with a gradient of composition. They characterized it, and they were able to figure out by using this type of EBSD mapping in which composition space you were actually having a single phase body centered cubic type of solid solution. And furthermore, they were also doing nano indentation type of studies in order to measure the mechanical properties of the different compositions. So this was another example where one could use a combinatorial material processing technique in order to rapidly look at a host of different alloys and characterize their structure and properties. The final example I want to talk about is that of diffusion multiples. You would have heard about diffusion couples and the Kirkendall effect and so on. So if you make a diffusion couple, if you take two different entities, let us just keep things simple and talk about two different elements A and B. You bring them in contact and then you heat them. And after that you will monitor using EDS type of analysis or maybe a WDS type of analysis how much A is diffusing into the B block and how much B is diffusing into the A block. So diffusion couple is a method by which you can study the diffusion mechanisms or the interdiffusion mechanisms between two different materials. This concept is then extended to form something known as a diffusion multiple. And the advantage over here is when you consider the measurement by diffusion couple, the measurement of the diffusion constants becomes quite time consuming, laborious and expensive. So using this diffusion multiple type of approach is a way of accelerating the measurement of diffusion constants. This is really important in a variety of engineering problems. So for instance, if you are looking at the jet engines, the turbine blades are often made out of superalloys, single crystal superalloys. So in this case, we are looking at CMSX4, and then what you do is on top of the superalloy, you deposit a bond coat which is supposed to protect the alloy from oxidation. Now the bond coat has one composition, the superalloy has another composition. The superalloy is an extremely complex chemistry material with lots and lots of different elements, and therefore when you have the bond coat and the superalloy together being exposed to a very high temperature, in between you have the formation of an interdiffusion zone, and in the interdiffusion zone you might be having a bunch of intermetallics forming, which makes it very brittle. So understanding this problem and understanding what is really diffusing fast and what is really promoting the formation of this intermetallic phases is going to be extremely useful for us. So by and large, you will be having things which we call topologically close packed phases or Lavis phases that are forming over here. Now, in order to study this fairly complex problem, one can create a diffusion multiple that looks like this. So here, for instance, I have 4 elements whose interdiffusion I am interested in. So there is niobium, there is chromium, there is silicon, and then there is titanium. And then this entire thing is being put inside a niobium can and hot pressed. So as a result, now I am starting to create multiple interfaces. So I have a titanium niobium interface, a niobium silicon interface, a niobium chromium interface, you have a chromium titanium interface, and so on. So when you are looking at these interfaces, what you basically do is you will scan across the interface, do EPMA type of measurements, and you will get an idea of how much the concentration has changed and therefore how much of one element has diffused into other element. Now this type of experiment can be done by annealing this diffusion multiple as a function of temperature, meaning you do the annealing at different temperature, or you pick a temperature, hold it for different time, and then when you do this entire matrix of heat treatments and you look at the EPMA profiles, from one single sample you start getting the interdiffusion coefficients of multiple sets of elements. So just to give you an idea, supposing we are looking at a quaternary system like moly-niobium silicon boron, the way you would want to design your diffusion multiple is to have chunks of moly, silicon and boron. So now we have created moly-boron interface, silicon-boron interface, moly-silicon interface, and then on top of it you enclose them in a niobium can. Why niobium can? Because you'll be pressing everything together to ensure that all the interfaces are in proper contact, and niobium is relatively ductile amongst these 4 elements, and so you use the niobium can on the outside. So now you start generating the interface between moly and niobium, silicon and niobium, boron and niobium. So that is how you are creating this diffusion multiple. So if you think of this diffusion multiple, it will look like this type of a cylindrical block, of which one slice is made out of moly, one slice is made out of boron, one slice is made out of silicon, and then all of it is contained inside this niobium can. And then what you want to do is, at different time intervals, you will want to cut different slices. So you want to cut the slices like this, so that you can see all of the interfaces. So you pick a temperature, you cut the slices at different times, so you will get slices like this. Look at the composition variation across the interface, and from there you will start getting to see that this zone in which the diffusion is occurring is progressively thickening. So based on this data, you will be able to compute the diffusion constants. So when you are using this type of diffusion multiple concepts, you can rapidly do the diffusivity measurements. That's one advantage. One can also start doing phase diagram determination, but then with the phase diagram determination, you always have to be a little bit careful to see that no non-equilibrium phase is forming. Once you have gotten the interdiffusion and maybe you have got a bunch of intermetallics forming or solid solution forming, one can then perform nanoscale experiments to estimate the mechanical properties. Now, before we end for today, I just want to caution you about a couple of things related to this type of combinatorial experimentation. The first thing, as I have mentioned before, these experiments are non-equilibrium in nature, and therefore the structures and the physical property measurements may not match exactly with the standard near equilibrium processes. And the second thing I want to emphasize is this is really where, if you are able to use physics-based modeling and statistical analysis, This can help you improve the fidelity of the experiments. That's one thing. And second thing is, if you are somehow certain that this type of combinatorial experiments is not really capturing the physics of the near equilibrium processes, if you can do the computational modeling, you will be able to generate some synthetic data with which you can start training your machine learning model. But then that is a separate discussion. Next time we are going to talk about high throughput characterization, and after that we will talk about synthetic data. So with that, let us bring our discussions to an end for today. Thank you for joining.